The cantina on Station Meridian was quiet tonight. Most of the patrons kept to themselves, nursing their drinks and trying to forget the memories that haunted them. The war had ended 5 years ago, but its scars remained fresh on every face in the room. Commander Zeftar sat alone at a corner table, his massive form hunched over a glass of Valorian fire wine. The blue liquid glowed softly, casting strange shadows across his battle-scarred carapace, where his left arm should have been. A crude cybernetic limb whirred softly as he lifted the glass. His right leg was also artificial, a reminder of the plasma blast that had nearly killed him on Xerion Prime. The Valorian's 3 eyes moved constantly, a habit he had developed during the war. Even in this neutral station, he could not shake the feeling that death might come at any moment. The Zerathi war machines had taught him that paranoia was often the only thing that kept a warrior alive. Zeftar touched the deep burn scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. The Zerathi had left their mark on him, just as they had left their mark on billions of others across the galaxy. His people, the Valorians, had lost 60% of their population fighting those mechanical monsters. Entire worlds had been turned to ash and metal. The cantina door hissed open and a group of beings entered. Zeftar glanced up briefly, then looked away. He had no interest in company tonight. The newcomers were mostly humans, he noticed, though there were a few other species mixed in. They wore the clean uniforms of the Galactic Reconstruction Council. Zeftar snorted quietly. Politicians and bureaucrats. People who showed up after the real fighting was done to take credit for the victory. He had seen their type before. They would make speeches about unity and rebuilding while real warriors like him drank alone, trying to forget the friends they had lost. One of the humans, a woman with short dark hair, glanced in his direction. Zeftar quickly looked away. He had nothing to say to soft civilians who had never seen real combat. The woman was small and unremarkable, like most humans. Her uniform was crisp and new, without a single battle decoration. The human delegation found a large table near the center of the cantina. They spoke in quiet voices, occasionally laughing at some joke. The sound made Zeftar's mandibles clench. How could they laugh when so many had died? Did they not understand what the galaxy had lost? A younger Valorian approached their table. Zeftar recognized him as Sub-Commander Velkan, one of the station's diplomatic attachés. The young warrior still had both his original arms and legs. Lucky Fool had missed the worst of the fighting. Velkan began making introductions with the human delegation. Zeftar tried to ignore them, but their voices carried in the quiet cantina. He heard titles and names that meant nothing to him. Council this, ambassador that. All meaningless words from people who had never held a weapon in anger. Then he heard something that made him pause. Captain Sarah Chen, formerly of the Terran Defense Force, Velkan was saying. She commanded a battle group during the Kepler 442b campaign. Zeftar's 3 eyes snapped to the small human woman. Kepler 442b. He knew that name. Every warrior in the galaxy knew that name. It had been one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. The Zerathi had thrown everything they had at that system. The fighting had lasted for 8 months, and when it was over, the orbital space around the planet had been thick with debris from destroyed ships. But that had been early in the war. Very early. Most species had not even known the Zerathi existed when Kepler 442b was burning. How could this small human have been there? Captain Chen was younger than Zeftar had expected. She looked to be in her 30s, though humans aged differently than Valorians. Her face was calm and professional, but when she smiled at something Velkan said, Zeftar noticed that her eyes remained cold. He had seen that look before in the mirrors and on the faces of other veterans. It was the look of someone who had seen too much death. The introductions continued, but Zeftar found himself studying the human captain more closely. Now that he looked, he could see the signs he had missed before. The way she sat with her back to the wall, the way her eyes tracked movement around the room, the slight tremor in her left hand that she tried to hide by keeping it in her lap. This was not some soft civilian. This was a warrior, but that made no sense. Humans had joined the war late, just like most of the other species. The Valorians and a few others had borne the worst of the fighting in the early years. Everyone knew that. Captain Chen said something that made the others at her table laugh. She glanced around the cantina as she did, and her eyes met Zeftar's for a brief moment. There was no fear in her gaze, no discomfort at being stared at by a battle-scarred alien. Instead, she gave him a small nod of acknowledgement, one warrior recognizing another. Zeftar found himself standing before he realized what he was doing. His cybernetic leg whirred as he walked across the cantina toward the human table. Velkan looked surprised to see him approaching. "Commander Zeftar," the younger Valorian said quickly. "May I present Captain Sarah Chen of the Terran Defense Force?" Captain Chen stood and extended her hand in the human gesture of greeting. Zeftar looked at it for a moment, then carefully took it in his remaining natural hand. Her grip was firm and calloused. These were not the soft hands of a bureaucrat. "An honor, Commander," she said in accented but clear galactic standard. "I have heard of the Valorian resistance at the Zerion defense line. Your people's sacrifice saved millions of lives." Zeftar studied her face. "You mentioned Kepler 442b, he said slowly. "I was told no humans fought in that battle." Captain Chen's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes. "Information travels slowly during wartime," she said. "Many records were lost." "The battle happened 12 years ago," Zeftar continued. "Early in the war, most species did not even know the Zerathi existed then." "That is true," Captain Chen agreed. "Most species did not know." There was something in the way she said it that made Zeftar's skin crawl, a weight behind the words that suggested terrible knowledge. He had heard that tone before from Valorian veterans who had survived the worst battles. "But humans knew," he said. It was not a question. Captain Chen looked at him for a long moment. Around them, the cantina continued its quiet business. Other veterans drank and tried to forget. Diplomats talked and planned for a future built on the bones of the past. "Yes," she said finally. "Humans knew." The simple admission hit Zeftar like a plasma blast to the chest. If humans had known about the Zerathi 12 years ago, if they had been fighting at Kepler 442b, then everything he thought he knew about the war was wrong. Captain Chen gestured to an empty chair at their table. "Would you like to sit, Commander? I think there are some things about the war that you might find interesting." Zeftar's cybernetic leg locked for a moment as competing thoughts raced through his mind. Then slowly he sat down. He had a feeling that whatever Captain Chen was about to tell him would change everything he thought he knew about the war, about humans and about the price that had been paid for victory. The battle-scarred alien leaned forward, his three eyes fixed on the small human woman, and waited to learn the truth. Captain Chen looked around the table at her fellow delegation members, then back at Zeftar. The other humans seemed to understand something passed between them without words, because they quietly excused themselves and moved to another table. Soon, only the Valorian commander and the human captain remained. Chen poured herself a drink from the bottle on the table. Her movements were precise and economical, like someone who had learned to conserve energy during long campaigns. She offered the bottle to Zeftar, who declined with a shake of his massive head. 15 years, she said suddenly, staring into her glass. "I have been away from home for 15 years. I am looking forward to seeing New Sydney Colony again." Zeftar's enhanced mind, augmented with military tactical computers, began processing the timeline automatically. The war had ended 5 years ago. If she had been away for 15 years, that meant she had left home 10 years before the war officially ended. But the war had only lasted 12 years total. His three eyes narrowed. "The war began 12 years ago," he said slowly. "For most species, yes," Chen agreed. The Galactic Council officially declared war on the Zerathi 12 years ago, when they attacked the Valorian colonies in the Zerion system, but not for humans. Chen took a sip of her drink. "No, not for humans. When did it begin for humans?" 18 years ago. The words were spoken quietly, but they hit Zeftar like a hammer blow. "We encountered them at the edge of our territory, in systems most species considered worthless. Dead zones, you called them. Too far from trade routes, too few resources, too dangerous to be worth colonizing." Zeftar felt something cold forming in his stomach. The dead zones. Those were staging areas. For decades, we think, the Zerathi had been building their forces in those empty systems, using them as bases to launch their invasion of the galaxy. But humans are stubborn. We colonize places other species think are worthless. We had settlements in 17 dead zone systems. Had? Chen's expression grew distant. The Zerathi found us first, before anyone knew they existed, before anyone knew what they were capable of. We thought they were just another hostile alien species at first. Pirates, maybe, or raiders from outside the galaxy. She paused, her fingers tightening around her glass. We were so wrong, Zeftar leaned forward. As a military commander, he understood tactics and strategy. But what Chen was describing changed everything he thought he knew about the war. What happened to those colonies? 47 human worlds were completely destroyed in the first 3 years of fighting, Chen said matter-of-factly. Not just conquered, destroyed. The Zarathi did not take prisoners. They did not enslave populations. They converted everything organic into raw material for their war machines. The Valorian's cybernetic hand clenched involuntarily. He had seen Zarathi factory ships, had witnessed what they did to captured populations. The memory still gave him nightmares. But 47 entire worlds and the battle reports, he said. Why did no one know? There were no reports. The colonies were isolated, communications were cut, and when our ships went to investigate, they found empty systems. Planets stripped bare, atmosphere burned away, all life converted into Zarathi machines. We thought it was some kind of natural disaster at first, a plague maybe, or stellar phenomenon. Chen stood and walked to the cantina's viewport. Outside, stars wheeled slowly as the station rotated. It took us 2 years to understand what we were really fighting. By then, the Zarathi had built massive fleets using the resources from our dead worlds. They were ready to expand into the inhabited galaxy. But you stopped them. We delayed them. Chen's reflection in the viewport looked tired. Every ship, every colony, every human life we threw at them bought time for the rest of the galaxy. Time for species like yours to discover the threat and prepare defenses. Zeftar's tactical mind was racing now, recalculating everything he thought he knew about the early war. The Proxima Centauri system, the automated distress beacon that warned the galaxy about the Zarathi threat. That was a human beacon. Proxima Centauri was a human system. Chen turned back to face him. Population 43 million. It took the Zarathi 6 months to break our defenses there, long enough for the beacon to transmit complete tactical data about Zarathi ships, weapons, and tactics to every major species in the galaxy. The cold feeling in Zeftar's stomach was spreading. 43 million people. They all knew they were going to die. The evacuation ships had been destroyed in the first week of the siege, but they kept fighting because they knew the data they were gathering would save billions of other lives. Chen sat back down, her movements heavy with exhaustion. The Proxima defense was volunteer only. Anyone who wanted to leave could take a small ship and try to escape. Almost nobody left. Zeftar stared at the small human woman. In his culture, warriors who died defending their homes were honored above all others. But what Chen was describing went beyond anything in Valorian military tradition. An entire population choosing death to save strangers they would never meet. How many ships did humanity lose in those early battles? He asked. Chen looked confused. Ships? Your fleet losses. In the first years before the galaxy joined the fight, Commander, Chen said quietly. We did not lose ships. We lost entire star systems. The Zarathi glassed 47 human colonies before most species even knew they existed. Our fleet losses were measured in worlds, not vessels. The Valorian's remaining natural hand began to shake. He had commanded fleets, had seen thousands of his people die in battles across dozens of systems. He had thought he understood the scale of the war's devastation. But what Chen was describing was not warfare. It was extinction. Your people, he said slowly. How many survived? From the dead zone colonies? None. From the core human worlds that were attacked later? Maybe 12% of the total population. Chen's voice remained steady, professional. Humanity lost about 200 billion people in the first 6 years of fighting, before anyone else even knew there was a war. The number was so large that Zeftar's mind refused to process it at first. 200 billion. That was more than the current population of most species. The Valorians, with their 60% losses, had thought they had suffered the worst casualties of any species in the war. They had been wrong. Why? He asked. Why have your people never spoken of this? Why does the galaxy not know? Chen smiled, but there was no humor in it. Because the war is over, Commander. The dead are gone. The living have to build something worth their sacrifice. She finished her drink and set the glass down with careful precision. Besides, who would believe it? Zeftar sat in silence, his 3 eyes fixed on the human captain. Everything he had thought he knew about the war, about humanity's role in it, about the price of victory, was crumbling around him. The small, unremarkable woman sitting across from him represented something he was only beginning to understand. Humanity had not just fought in the war. They had been fighting and dying for the galaxy's survival years before anyone else even knew they were in danger. And they had never asked for recognition or gratitude. They had simply done what needed to be done. Zeftar's cybernetic hand made a soft whirring sound as he reached for his glass. His movements were slow, careful, as if the simple act of drinking might somehow help him process what he was learning. Chen watched him with patient eyes, the kind of patience that came from explaining terrible truths to people who had never imagined they existed. The early years, Zeftar said finally, when humanity was fighting alone. What were those battles like? Chen was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the cantina continued its quiet business. Other veterans drank and shared war stories, but their tales seemed small now compared to what Zeftar was hearing. Different from what came later, Chen said. We had no idea what we were facing. No tactical data. No understanding of their technology. No allies to call for help. Every battle was a learning experience bought with blood. She gestured to a faint scar on her left temple, barely visible beneath her hair. I got this at the Battle of Tau Ceti. I was a junior lieutenant then, commanding a patrol corvette. We thought we were responding to a pirate raid on a mining station. What did you find? Hell! The word was spoken simply without drama. The mining station was gone. Not destroyed, converted. The Zarathi had turned the entire facility into a factory ship. It was manufacturing combat drones using the bodies of the miners. Zeftar's three eyes widened. He had seen Zarathi factory ships before, but always from a distance. The idea of stumbling across one with no warning, no preparation made his blood run cold. We tried to fight it, Chen continued. 12 corvettes against something the size of a moon. We lasted maybe 20 minutes. I was the only survivor from my ship. The emergency pod drifted for 6 days before a rescue ship found me. But you learned something. We learned that Zarathi shields were vulnerable to concentrated plasma fire. Cost us 11 ships and 200 good people. But that information saved thousands of lives in later battles. Chen's voice remained steady, but Zeftar could see the weight of those memories in her eyes. That was how it went in the early years. Every tactical advantage we gained cost us everything. Zeftar thought of his own battles, of the carefully planned campaigns with full intelligence and allied support. Even with all those advantages, the fighting had been brutal. He could not imagine facing the Zarathi blind with no preparation. The Sol defense network, he said suddenly. The barrier systems that protected the core worlds during the final push. Those were based on human technology. Chen nodded. Prototypes. We built the first one around Earth after the Zarathi broke through our outer colonies. It was crude, barely functional, but it worked. Kept Earth safe for 3 years while we refined the design. But the galaxy's records show that humanity contributed the Sol defense specifications to the Allied forces only 8 years ago. That is correct. Chen poured herself another drink. We spent 4 years perfecting the technology on our own. Testing it, improving it, making sure it would work for other species' ships and technologies. When we finally shared it with the Alliance, it was ready for immediate deployment. The implications hit Zeftar like a plasma blast. You could have protected your own worlds. But you gave the technology away. The Zarathi were building faster than we could deploy defenses. Earth was safe. But we had dozens of other colonies that were still vulnerable. We had to choose. Protect only human worlds or share the technology and protect everyone. Chen met his gaze steadily. It was not a difficult choice. Zeftar leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. In Valorian culture, military technology was sacred. The idea of sharing advanced defensive systems with other species, especially during wartime, was almost unthinkable. Yet humans had done exactly that. How many human colonies were lost while you were protecting others? 17 more systems fell while we were teaching other species to build Sol defense networks, Chen said quietly. But 43 core world systems were saved. The mathematics were clear. 17 systems, billions of people. The needs of the many, Chen said simply. Besides, we had learned something important by then. The Zarathi could be beaten. It just required the right kind of sacrifice. There was something in the way she said that last word that made Zeftar's skin crawl. What kind of sacrifice? Chen stood again and walked to the viewport. For a moment, she was silent, watching the stars wheel past. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. We discovered that Zarathi machines could be temporarily disrupted by extreme electromagnetic fields, very specific kinds of fields, generated in very specific ways. She turned back to face him. Human neural networks, when they burned out under extreme stress, produced exactly the right kind of interference. The cold feeling in Zeftar's stomach turned to ice. Neural networks. You mean human brains? Yes. When they died in certain patterns of agony, they created brief windows where our weapons could penetrate Zarathi defenses. Chen returned to her seat, her movements mechanical. We called them neural disruption arrays. Volunteers would connect themselves to specialized equipment that would kill them, but create openings for our ships to attack. Zeftar's cybernetic hand began to shake. He had heard rumors of human suicide weapons during the war, but he had never imagined anything like this. How many volunteers? For the major battles? Usually between 10 and 50,000 per engagement. They would sacrifice themselves in coordinated waves, creating gaps in Zarathi defenses that lasted just long enough for our attack ships to strike vital targets. The Valorian stared at her in horror. 50,000 people, dying in agony, in every major battle. It was the only way we could hurt them, Chen said. The Zarathi had shields that could stop any known weapon, but they had never encountered a species that would willingly destroy its own neural patterns to create tactical advantages. Their defenses were not designed for that kind of warfare. Zeftar tried to imagine it. Thousands of humans connecting themselves to machines that would kill them, all to create a few seconds of vulnerability in enemy defenses. The scale of the sacrifice was beyond anything he had ever heard of. You yourself, he said slowly, noticing the way Chen occasionally favored her left side. You were in one of these arrays, Chen nodded. The Battle of Kepler 442b. I was connected to a partial disruption array, designed to cause brain damage but not death. We needed some survivors who could report on the effectiveness of the technique. She touched her temple again. I was unconscious for 3 months afterward. When I woke up, we had won the battle. At what cost? 37,000 volunteers died in the arrays. Another 112,000 died in the follow-up assault. Chen's voice remained steady, professional, but we saved the system. 3 billion people lived because of those sacrifices. Zeftar felt his world tilting. Everything he thought he knew about warfare, about sacrifice, about the price of victory was being rewritten. The humans had not just fought the Zarathi, they had learned to die in ways that would hurt the enemy most. They had turned their own extinction into a weapon. Why? He whispered. Why would anyone volunteer for such a thing? Chen smiled then, and for the first time there was something approaching warmth in her expression. Because we understood something that the Zarathi never could. Some things are worth dying for. Some fights are worth any price. She leaned forward, her voice growing stronger. We were not just fighting for our own survival, Commander. We were fighting for the future of every sentient species in the galaxy, including yours. The battle-scarred alien sat in silence, his 3 eyes fixed on the small human woman. He was beginning to understand that Captain Sarah Chen was not just a veteran of the war. She was a survivor of something far worse, a conflict so brutal, so desperate, that it had required humanity to sacrifice not just their lives, but their very humanity itself. And they had done it willingly, gladly, to save people they had never met. The cantina had grown quieter as the night progressed. Many of the other patrons had left, leaving only the most dedicated drinkers and those like Zeftar who had nowhere else to go. The Valorian commander found himself unable to move, unable to process what he was learning about the war he thought he had fought. Chen seemed to understand his state of mind. She sat patiently, occasionally sipping her drink, giving him time to absorb the terrible mathematics of human sacrifice. When she spoke again, her voice was gentle, almost motherly. There is more, Commander. Things that were never recorded in any official reports. Things that only the survivors remember. Zeftar's 3 eyes focused on her with difficulty. More? The neural disruption arrays were just one technique we developed. As the war progressed, we discovered other ways to hurt the Zarathi. Each method required different kinds of sacrifice. Chen's fingers traced patterns on the table, as if drawing diagrams only she could see. For instance, we learned that Zarathi communication networks could be jammed by specific types of quantum interference. Quantum interference. Generated by human consciousness at the moment of death. Not just any death, it had to be voluntary, calculated, timed precisely. We called them consciousness bombs. Chen's voice remained steady, but Zeftar could see her hands trembling slightly. A single human, dying at exactly the right moment in exactly the right way, could blind an entire Zarathi battle fleet for up to 30 seconds. The Valorian's cybernetic leg locked as his organic brain struggled to process this information. One person. 30 seconds. 30 seconds was enough time for our ships to target and destroy enemy command vessels. We used consciousness bombs in every major space battle after the 7th year. Chen looked up at him. Do you know how many humans volunteered for single-use missions like that? Zeftar could not speak. He shook his head. Millions, literally millions of people volunteered to die alone in space, timing their deaths to the microsecond, just to give our fleets tactical advantages that lasted less than a minute. Chen's voice grew softer. They would sit in small scout ships flying directly at Zarathi formations, calculating the precise moment when their sacrifice would do the most good. The ice in Zeftar's stomach was spreading through his entire body. He had commanded fleets, had ordered soldiers into battles where death was likely. But what Chen was describing was not warfare. It was systematic self-extinction in the service of strategy. The volunteers, he managed to say. How did you choose them? We did not choose them. They chose themselves. Chen stood and walked to the viewport again. We would announce the mission parameters, location, timing, tactical objectives. Then we would wait. There were always more volunteers than we could use. But why? How could so many people willingly choose death? Chen was quiet for a long moment, her reflection wavering in the curved glass. Have you ever seen a Zarathi processing plant, Commander? Have you ever watched them convert living beings into raw materials for their war machines? Zeftar had. Once. The memory still woke him screaming in the middle of the night. Every human who volunteered for a suicide mission had lost someone to the Zarathi. Family, friends, entire communities. They understood what would happen to the galaxy if we lost. Chen turned back to him. When you have seen children fed into biomechanical converters, when you have watched your parents turned into spare parts for enemy robots, death in service of victory becomes preferable to life under Zarathi rule. The Valorian tried to imagine the mindset required for such a choice. In his culture, warriors who died in battle were honored, but they died fighting, trying to live. What Chen was describing was different, calculated, cold. The psychological impact on your species, he said slowly. How did humanity survive such systematic sacrifice? Many of us did not. Chen returned to her seat. Suicide rates among non-combatants were 30 times normal levels during the war. Depression, psychosis, complete mental breakdown, these became common. Entire human colonies had to be evacuated, not because of enemy action, but because the population had become unable to function. She paused, her fingers working at a small scar on her wrist that Zeftar had not noticed before. But those who survived developed something new, a kind of shared understanding about the value of existence. We learned to treasure life precisely because we had become so good at ending it. And after the war, when other species joined the fight, relief, incredible relief. For the first time, Chen's professional composure cracked slightly. When the Valorian fleet arrived at the Battle of Zerion Prime, when we saw your ships fighting alongside ours, many humans wept. Not from fear or sadness, but from joy. We were no longer alone. Zeftar remembered that battle. He had been a junior officer then, commanding a single destroyer in the massive fleet action. He recalled the strange tactics used by human ships, seemingly reckless attacks that somehow always succeeded, impossible maneuvers that sacrificed individual vessels to save the larger formation. Now he understood. The humans had not been reckless. They had been efficient. They had learned to calculate the precise cost of victory and pay it without hesitation. The Battle of Zerion Prime, he said slowly. Your ship saved my squadron. I was cut off, surrounded, my engines were failing. 3 human cruisers broke formation to extract us. All 3 were destroyed, Chen nodded. The captain of the lead cruiser was named Martinez. I knew her. She had lost her entire family at the siege of New Barcelona. Saving your squadron was probably the first purely tactical decision she had made in years. No suicide weapons. No calculated self-sacrifice, just good old-fashioned naval tactics. She died to save strangers. She died to save allies. There is a difference. Chen's smile was sad but genuine. By the time other species joined the war, humans had become very good at dying. But we had also remembered how to live for something other than revenge. Zeftar thought of Captain Martinez, whom he had never met, who had died to save his life and the lives of his crew. At the time, he had assumed it was standard human military doctrine. Now he realized it had been something far more profound. How many humans survived the entire 18 years of war? He asked. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Survived with their minds intact? Maybe 12,000 worldwide. The number hit Zeftar like a physical blow. 12,000. Out of how many? Humanity had a population of approximately 400 billion when the war began. Chen's voice was barely audible. Most died in the first 6 years, when the Zerathi were processing entire worlds. Of those who survived the initial attacks, most volunteered for suicide missions or died in conventional battles. The few who made it to the end of the war. She trailed off, staring into her drink. You are one of 12,000 people who remember what humanity was like before the war, Zeftar said slowly. What humanity was like, what we became during the war, and what we are trying to rebuild now. Chen looked up at him. The children born since the war ended have never known the kind of desperation that made suicide weapons seem reasonable. They are different. Better, I think. Zeftar sat in stunned silence, his enhanced mind trying to calculate the true scope of human sacrifice. The numbers were too large, too terrible to fully comprehend. An entire species had volunteered for extinction to save the rest of the galaxy. And they had never asked for recognition. Never demanded gratitude. Never even told their story until now. Zeftar sat completely motionless. His cybernetic limbs had locked in place, their servos silent. His 3 eyes stared at Captain Chen without blinking, as if moving might somehow make the terrible truth she had shared disappear. The cantina around them had grown quiet, most of the other patrons having left for the night. Only a few die-hard drinkers remained at distant tables, lost in their own memories. Chen seemed to understand that he needed time to process what he had learned. She sat patiently, occasionally glancing out the viewport at the stars, but mostly watching the Valorian commander with the kind of gentle attention that medical personnel gave to patients recovering from severe trauma. Finally, after what felt like hours, Zeftar spoke. His voice was barely a whisper. The galaxy owes humanity a debt that can never be repaid. Chen shook her head slowly. The galaxy owes humanity nothing, Commander. We did what needed to be done. That is all. No. Zeftar's voice grew stronger, though his body remained frozen. You do not understand. My people, the Valorians, we pride ourselves on being the greatest warriors in the galaxy. We have built our entire culture around concepts of honor, sacrifice, and military service. But what you have described, it is beyond anything we could imagine. He paused, struggling to find words for what he was feeling. We lost 60% of our population fighting the Zerathi, and we consider it the greatest sacrifice in our history. But you lost 97% of your people. You turned death itself into a weapon. You made extinction into strategy. Chen's expression remained calm. We did what we had to do. But why have your people never spoken of this? Why does the galaxy celebrate Valorian heroism and Krillin tactical genius and hegemony sacrifice? But no one knows what humanity endured. Zeftar's cybernetic hand clenched involuntarily. Why is this the first time I am hearing the truth? Because the war is over, Commander. Chen leaned forward slightly. The dead are gone, but the living still need to build something worth their sacrifice. What purpose would it serve to tell the galaxy that humanity became monsters in order to save them? Monsters? Zeftar's 3 eyes widened. You think you became monsters? Did we not? Chen's voice was soft but steady. We learned to calculate the exact value of a life in tactical advantage. We developed weapons that required conscious beings to die in agony. We convinced millions of people to commit suicide for strategic objectives. If that is not monstrous, what is? The Valorian stared at her, his enhanced mind racing. In his culture, warriors who died protecting others were the highest form of hero. But what Chen was describing went beyond heroism into something else entirely. Something that had no name in any language he knew. You saved us, he said finally. All of us. Every species in the galaxy. You paid a price that no one should ever have to pay. And you did it willingly. We did it because it needed to be done, Chen repeated, and because we were the only ones who could do it. The Zerathi had never encountered a species willing to weaponize its own extinction. They had no defenses against that kind of warfare. She stood and walked to the viewport one final time, Outside, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the struggles of the small beings who lived and died in their light. There is something else you should know, Commander. Something that explains why the Zerathi finally stopped expanding, why they became vulnerable to conventional tactics in the final years of the war. Zeftar's locked servos whirred as he forced himself to turn and look at her. What? They learned to fear us. Chen's reflection in the glass seemed to glow faintly in the starlight. The Zerathi were machines, but they had advanced artificial intelligence. They could learn, adapt, evolve their tactics, and what they learned was that humans were not like other species. In what way? Other species, when faced with extinction, would fight with everything they had. But they would still try to survive. They would seek victory through superior tactics, better weapons, stronger defenses. They would fight to live. Chen turned back to face him. Humans fought to die well. The distinction hit Zeftar like a revelation. They could not predict your tactics because your tactics were not designed for survival. Exactly. Zerathi battle computers were programmed to fight enemies who wanted to continue existing. They could not model the behavior of an enemy that treated individual survival as a secondary concern. Chen's smile was small and cold. In the final years of the war, Zerathi fleets would retreat when they detected human ships, even when they had overwhelming tactical advantage. They were afraid, terrified. Their artificial minds could not process the concept of an enemy that became more dangerous as it approached extinction. Every conventional model they had for military behavior was useless against an opponent that viewed death as a tactical option rather than something to be avoided. Zeftar felt something shifting in his understanding of the war, of the final campaigns that had seemed almost easy compared to the brutal early years. That is why the Alliance offensives were so successful. The Zerathi were already broken. Not broken. Confused. They had spent years fighting an enemy that did not behave like any other form of life they had encountered. By the time other species joined the war, the Zerathi had become hesitant, uncertain. They had learned to expect the impossible from any engagement involving humans. Chen returned to her seat and finished the last of her drink. There is one final thing you should know, Commander. Something that might help you understand why we have never spoken of this. What? The children born since the war ended have never heard these stories. The new colonies being built are not populated by survivors like me. They are populated by people who were born after the fighting stopped. People who have never known the kind of desperation that made suicide weapons seem reasonable. She set her glass down with careful precision. We want them to grow up human, not as weapons. We want them to value life, to seek joy, to build families and create art and explore the universe for the pure pleasure of discovery. They should never have to know what we became. The weight of that statement settled over Zeftar like a heavy blanket. An entire generation of humans growing up ignorant of their species' greatest sacrifice, protected from the knowledge of what their parents and grandparents had done to ensure their existence. So you carry this burden alone, he said. 12,000 of us carry it, and each year, a few more die of old age or finally succumb to the psychological damage from the war. Soon there will be none of us left who remember. Chen stood, gathering her things. Perhaps that is for the best. Zeftar tried to stand, but his servos remained locked. He watched helplessly as the small human woman prepared to leave, taking with her the most terrible and heroic story he had ever heard. Captain, he called out. Why did you tell me? Why break the silence? Chen paused at the edge of the table. Because you asked, Commander. Because you were there, in the war, and you deserve to know the truth about what you were fighting for. She looked down at him with something that might have been pity. And because sometimes the burden of carrying such knowledge alone becomes too heavy, even for us. She turned to go, then stopped one final time. There is something else. Something I want you to remember. What? We won. Her voice was soft but filled with quiet pride. Humanity became something monstrous, sacrificed everything we were, paid a price that nearly drove us extinct. But we won. The Zerathi are gone. The galaxy is safe. Children of every species can grow up without fear. She smiled then, and for the first time it reached her eyes. Every human who died in those 18 years, every person who volunteered for suicide missions, every soul who sacrificed themselves in neural disruption arrays, they all knew this day would come. They all knew that their deaths would purchase life for billions of others. Captain Sarah Chen walked away, leaving Zeftar alone at the table. The Valorian commander sat motionless, his three eyes staring at the empty glass she had left behind. His enhanced mind tried to process the scope of what he had learned, but the numbers were too large, the sacrifice too complete, the heroism too pure for even military computers to calculate. Somewhere in the distance he could hear the sound of laughter, young voices, people who had been born after the war, enjoying their lives in a universe made safe by the sacrifice of a species that had chosen extinction over defeat. The battle-scarred alien finally understood why the galaxy's most dangerous enemies had learned to fear a species most others still underestimated. Humanity had not just survived the war. They had transcended it, becoming something beyond victory or defeat, beyond life or death. They had become hope itself, purchased with blood and measured in the laughter of children who would never know what their freedom had cost. Slowly, Zeftar's servos unlocked. He stood, his movements careful and deliberate, and performed the traditional Valorian salute to fallen warriors. Not to the empty air where Captain Chen had been, but to the memory of 400 billion humans who had died so that others might live. Then he walked away, carrying the truth like a sacred flame, knowing that he would never see the universe the same way again,